Welcome to The Breakdown with Bradcorp and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scher.
And I'm Michael Bradcorp.
Today, we are pleased to be joined by one of our returning guests, Representative Pat Garofalo. Representative Garofalo was first elected to the Minnesota House in 2004 and earlier this year announced that this is his final term in the state legislature. He represents the Farmington area, has chaired a couple of committees, and currently serves as a minority lead on the House Ways and Means Committee. We first spoke to Garofalo just over a year ago to discuss the start of the trifecta up at the Capitol, sports betting, and Minnesota becoming the next California politically. Today, we will follow up on our last conversations and see how things have evolved over the last 15 months. We will break down where sports betting stands and if the legislature will be able to pass a fix to the Uber-Lyft debacle. We will also break down Garofalo's 20-year career in the legislature and what is next. Then we will hit what seems to be a weekly topic and break down former President Donald Trump's comments on abortion. We will then step outside of politics to discuss college basketball, and namely Caitlin Clark and her impact on women's sports. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. We are excited to be joined once again by Representative Pat Garofalo. Representative, you were with us just a little over a year ago at the start of the 2023 legislative session. So I want to start by just getting your take on how things have gone over the last 15 months here. We saw everything that came out of the last session, what's been being worked through this session. Are you surprised? Are you not surprised? What's your overall sentiment?
First, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Since we last talked, I think the biggest change has been that the legislative session completely met last year. A budget was passed, and in the choice between being a center left or a hard left, the Minnesota DFL really chose a very hard left, far left governing strategy, both fiscally and on social policies. Even though they only have a one-seat majority in the House, and they have just a one-seat majority in the Senate and a three-seat majority in the House, they really have governed as if though they have a supermajority mandate. And all you have to do is look at the budget to understand just how totally far left they've gone. They increased the general fund budget by 36.5%, which is no state budget in the country grew as much as the Democrats grew Minnesota's last year. And it's completely unsustainable. So a lot of these programs that they funded and stood up next year are going to have to be cut regardless of who wins the elections in the House, because the governor's not on the ballot this year, the Senate's not on the ballot, but the state House is. And so even if the Democrats were to keep the majority in the House, the general fund is projected to contract by $5 billion. They're going to have to, just to keep spending at what it's at, they're going to need billions in tax increases. Again, we've had a debate in Minnesota for a long time about whether Minnesota is a center-left or a center-right state. But it's only recently that we've seen Democrats argue that Minnesota is a hard left, far left state. And that's what's going to be on the ballot this November.
And I certainly want to get into this upcoming election cycle. One of the big things we talked about last time with you was that Minnesota is the next California in terms of political environment. Are you surprised? Did you go into the 2023 legislative session with the trifecta cautiously optimistic that they were going to stay center right or center left, or was this not a shock that they went as hard left as they did?
I think everybody was surprised how far they lurched to the left. Again, no surprise that as a conservative, I was going to be disappointed with what the Democrats did. You can expect that, but just the sheer magnitude of what they chose to fund, building an insurance company inside of the state government so that now every private sector individual, when they want to have paid leave, is going to have to call the government to get that. Things like that are pretty, the anti-law enforcement stuff that got corrected earlier this year with the school resource officers. And of course, most recently, Governor Walz vetoed the bill, but they passed a bill that would set the wage for self-employed independent contractors who drive Uber and Lyft. And now we've seen that come back. So I was genuinely shocked because it seemed to me that if they were had a more centrist approach, they could build a long-term sustainable majority. Whereas this seems like they're more interested in, hey, we got the votes, let's do everything now because we may not have them this year. It's not very sustainable, and not from a political perspective nor an economic perspective.
Absolutely agree. Now, you just mentioned Uber and Lyft and the crisis going on in Minneapolis with surrounding that. We've spoken with Representative Elliot Engen, and we have talked about this quite a bit lately. You recently quoted that this is not an or unexpected natural disaster. This is not a crisis of current events. What we have before us is a Democrat created crisis. Go into that a little bit further.
Yeah, and so what happened was is the last year the Democrats in the legislature passed a bill that would have set minimum mandatory reimbursement rates for every single Uber and Lyft driver in the state of Minnesota. And these rates would be higher than anywhere else in the country. They'd be higher than Manhattan. And as a frame of reference, if a person were to drive Uber for an hour under the Democrats' bill, they get paid $90. And putting aside the economics and sustainability of how expensive it would be, I think quite a few of us would quit our jobs and drive Uber if that was the case, if it was $90 an hour. And so Walz rightfully so vetoed that, but then the Minneapolis City Council picked up the mantle and passed an ordinance. And so now we're staring down the barrel of a May 1st deadline of losing Uber and Lyft services in our state. And it's just putting aside the philosophy that you really shouldn't have government setting the wage for self-employed individuals, that's pretty strange. Just putting that aside, the model they're advocating for would destroy demand and reduce the quality of services. So it doesn't, Uber and Lyft are not charitable organizations. They exist to make a profit. And for 12 years, they lost a total of over $30 billion, at least Uber did. Last year is the first year that Uber made a profit. And mandating their cost structure be so high that it destroys demand is just it's a simple, basic mathematics. And we're seeing kind of short term here the consequences for this. And this goes beyond just someone has too much to drink at the bar and catches an Uber on the way home. There's a lot of people who are elderly, disabled, people who don't own vehicles, a lot of commerce that is dependent on rideshare. And this sort of intervention into the economy by the far left is symbolic of why Minnesota really does need to restore balance and restore some adult supervision at the Capitol. So I think the Uber Lyft situation with the far left of the DFL sort of hijacking this issue, it's symbolic of a bigger problem, and that is that the extremes are increasingly dominating the political dialogue, whether it's states like Minnesota with the Democrats in control or Marjorie Taylor Greene in the Congress threatening to take out the speaker. You have more and more people who are engaging in mindless, fact-free debates and are more interested in a hard far left or a hard far right ideology.
Can you expand on that for a second? Because would this type of Uber Lyft situation happen? Let's just change some of the Democratic composition and maybe some of the Republican too. Put yourself when you had have there be more centrists in the legislature. How would this situation have even developed, and what would be, from your institutional experience, what type of changes have made that make this a more difficult problem to solve?
If you had shared government at the legislative level, it's unlikely the Minneapolis City Council ever would have passed this ordinance because legislative leaders would have told them publicly that if you pass this ordinance, we're going to preempt or we're going to pass a law that says you can't do that. Especially now with Uber is already beginning the process of shutting things down. In the past, I think you would have had more moderate or centrist Democrats stand up to the far left and say we're not going to pass a bill that is going to set the wage for self-employed individuals. And obviously now the difference today is that not only does the far left have influence on the agenda, they are the ones driving the agenda. The fact that Governor Walz had to veto this bill last year should tell people just how crazy this idea is that we're setting wages for independent, self-employed individuals. It's very bizarre. Either you're an independent contractor or you're an employee. If you think that these drivers are employees, then you should say they're employees. You don't specify wages for self-employed individuals. It's very strange.
It is. And I think also you've raised a really good point about just the nature, the partisan shift of the legislature and that it's much more of a polarizing institution. And I think that this is, and I think your quote was spot on, that this is not an unexpected natural disaster. This is not a crisis of current events. We have before us is a Democrat created crisis. And I think that this is a really real world example. I know that there's been a substantive shift in kind of state government policy since the Democrats, as they hold all branches of government. But I think this is a recent situation that, as you correctly pointed out, is a Democratic created crisis.
Yeah, and all you have to do is just take a look at the data. People who drive Uber and Lyft right now, when they're driving, they get paid $52, and that's what the Department of Labor and Industries report is. And they have to engage in some pretty aggressive gymnastics to say that these people are not making minimum wage. For example, for those who are familiar with Uber and Lyft, you can, as a driver, you can accept or reject a ride. In this report, they say that if you reject a ride and then you wait 15 minutes before you're offered another one to drive, that you could get paid for that 15 minutes, even though you said you didn't want to drive that. That should be part of your hourly calculation. In that report, they say that none of their tipped income should count, so that none of that counts towards their so-called minimum wage. On top of that, you have they have some pretty ridiculous assumptions, like no one owns a cell phone unless they're an Uber driver. So you got to get full reimbursement for your cell phone bill, and on top of that, you assume that you're going to have $10,000 of vehicle depreciation every year. That doesn't count vehicle maintenance, insurance, all these other things. It really is a messed up set of assumptions. But again, what we're seeing, Minnesota's Democratic Party is already more left than most other Democratic parties. But given their very narrow legislative majorities, it's the far left that is dictating the agenda last session and this session. And I think that Governor Walz is starting to figure out that it's probably not in his best political interests to continue this forward.
I want to shift a little bit to something that is bipartisan that you've been a leader on, sports betting up at the Capitol. And this isn't the first time that this has been moving, but it certainly seems as maybe the first time it has substantial movement and potential. There was a recent committee hearing where it appears the tax rate was raised from 10% to 20%. You had tweeted that made this bill unworkable. Can you talk to us a little bit about that shift? And we're running up against the clock here, right? We've got 5 or 6 weeks left of the legislative session. What needs to happen? Is this going to get done? And what does this tax rate do to that?
A couple of things. So I was opposed to the increase in the tax rate, but they went from 10% to 20%. But I still think we can make that work in Minnesota. The issue is that in the Senate, they adopted an amendment that banned what's called in-game wagering. So you bet on a contest, 3/4 of the way through the contest, it looks like you're going to win, but you're like, I don't want to risk it. I just want to cash out my bet. I just want to take my money, take my winnings out. That's very common. That would be illegal in Minnesota. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. Or if, let's say, halfway through a game, you look out and there are revised betting lines on a game. So at halftime, you want to bet on a game. That would be illegal in Minnesota. And just to be clear, we would be the only state in the country that would have this prohibition on in-game wagering. And so it is, from an industry perspective, unworkable. But I'm not really at this point right now. The message I give people is that there's a lot of clunkers in the bill, from tax rate to what we do with the racetracks to it allows teenagers to bet on sports if they're in person. So I have problems with all those things. I just think we need to get the bill into conference committee and then try to address those concerns there. That's like fighting about it now, pre-posturing for negotiating. That's just going to throw sand in the gears to stop it. No one wins if we do that, unless you're an opponent of the bill. So whatever those concerns are, I just ask people, please vote for the bill, get it in the conference committee, and let's see if we can address those concerns there.
If I can have you explain to our listeners, what is, and from again, just a little bit of an explainer, explain the dynamics between the tribes that we have in Minnesota related to gambling and why this is such a complicated issue sometimes to get solved. Some of little bit of the history, maybe some of the political history, as a little bit of an explainer for our listeners.
And so in Minnesota, the only casino gambling we have is tribal. We have a tribal monopoly, and it's been that way since Rudy Purpose was governor. And so historically, Republicans used to advocate for an expansion. Some Republicans would advocate for an expansion of gambling, slot machines at Canterbury Park, and or running aces, and with that money going to the state or to enhance the pool available for horse breeding for the purses at racetracks. And that historically was very divisive. And then in 2012, Mystic Lake and Canterbury reached an agreement where they basically had a marketing agreement that Mystic Lake would supplement the purses at Canterbury, and there would be no efforts to expand gambling. It just brought regulatory peace in the area. And that agreement expired last year. And so now there's this discussion of relooking at casino wagering. I will tell you that the proposal to have slot machines at Canterbury was called I used to chief author that bill in the past. It's not a particularly fun issue to carry because it is so provocative, controversial, and divisive. But what we've got now is this fight about what does the future of gaming look like. And sports gambling isn't that particularly big of an issue. But what it does do is it sets the foundation for what the next wave of gambling is going to be, and that's digital. So if you look at Michigan or Pennsylvania, you are allowed to engage in casino activities on your cell phone from home. And in the future, if we were to do that here, if non-tribal entities were allowed to do that, it would be very disruptive and very, obviously, the tribal casinos would be very opposed to that. So they view sports gambling, particularly mobile sports gambling, as the foundation that will base that for what iGaming may be in the future. And so they are very opposed to anyone besides tribes offering mobile sports wagering or in-person sports wagering. So it creates a controversy on that side. And then, of course, the tracks, they view pari-mutuel wagering as a type of sports gambling. So if you're going to legalize sports gambling in Minnesota, why wouldn't the tracks be involved? And we're fighting at the legislature over who gets to make money off sports gambling. And hopefully we're able to find a win situation that addresses both the tracks concerns and the tribes as well.
Explain to our listeners one more thing. On a Sunday during the NFL season, you're watching. What can Minnesotans do for betting on sports versus what our neighbors to the south can do in Iowa?
So in Iowa, you can open up your phone, log into an app, and you can bet on an NFL game. You can bet who's going to win the game based on a point spread, the total points scored. You can engage in literally from your couch, you can engage in those things. In Minnesota, you can also do all those things. It's just that it's illegal, right? So you have to use a sports book that is overseas or unregistered. And that's happening right now. Some people are doing that. That's why from my perspective, I think the smart thing to do is to have a safe, regulated market in Minnesota. People are able to get their winnings, have consumer protections, make sure the money's not being used for illicit activities. But in Minnesota, you're not allowed legally to engage in all those things. That just over the border in Iowa, you can. And down in Iowa, they've got a dozen different sports books that are available that you can, again, as long as you're within the borders of Iowa, you can open up your phone and bet on any sport you want that's available.
Thank you for explaining that. I think it's good. I think Minnesota is always unique, and there's always an additional complication. So I appreciate you giving some backstory for our listeners on gaming, and particularly in a real world example, like on Sundays, what Minnesotans can't do in relation to our neighbors just next to us.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the gaming numbers from Iowa, they have reports on sports gambling, and it's pretty clear that the Diamond Joe's Casino, the FanDuel branch that's just over the Minnesota-Iowa border, is one of their biggest operators. And as someone who's been there before, I can tell you, you look at the parking lot, it's just full of Minnesota license plates, right? It's not people from Des Moines driving up to Northwood, Iowa. It's people from the Twin Cities that are driving there. And it's just, to me, it makes sense, but we just have to find a smart way that's a win. Again, we put money into problem gaming to make sure that those with addiction issues get the help they need, making sure we have protections and safeguards for consumers, but also this big fight about who's going to make money off it. It's a regulated industry, and that's what the legislature is fighting about right now, is who's going to make money off sports gambling.
So if you were a betting man, what odds would you give it of passing this year?
I am a betting man, Becky. So I would say that probably a little bit better than 50-50. Uh, but it's one of these things that doesn't have to happen. And we were discussing earlier the situation with Uber. And an issue like Uber can poison other issues. Sports gambling is an elective issue. We don't have to do it. If we have Uber shut down on May 1st in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, it's very hard to work on elective things when the things that we have to get done aren't getting done. And so that's why these things, as they get closer to the end of session, they get intertwined with each other. And it's just another reminder of just how complicated public policy can be. And keep in mind, the Democrats have total control, so they set the agenda on things. But this session, whether it's fixing the school resource officer issue, whether it's fixing Uber and Lyft, sports gambling, a bonding bill, these are all things that they need Republican votes to pass. And last session, they just didn't really, they just got used to telling people what to do. They can make all the decisions themselves. And they're, for a lot of their members, they have not developed the skill set of being able to collaborate and compromise. That's something we're running into right now.
So we've spoken a lot about how the impact and the repercussions of a lot of these policies are yet to be felt. We're starting to get some of them. Some of the new laws aren't taking effect until after this upcoming election. And you, after 20 years, are stepping away from the legislature, which we'll touch on what's next for you here briefly or shortly. But I want to talk about these upcoming elections. And when we spoke with you last, we talked about how Republicans need to speak to Republicans, to centrists, and even to some of the light Democrats. And we need to stop with that circular firing squads. As you're retiring and as you're stepping away from this, what advice do you have for either some of the legislators or candidates running here? I think you have been someone a lot of folks have looked to because you speak up, you speak loudly in a way that's always based in principle and policy and not in a way that's a distraction and causing issues. A lot in this question here, but what kind of advice do you have to your colleagues and other candidates running of how Republicans can flip the House in this upcoming election cycle and what we need to do when talking to voters?
Sure. The important thing is that I don't view politics, the ideas in politics have to be, those ideas to be successful don't have to be original to be good. I'm all about copying successful strategies that other people have implemented to win. So whether it's Maryland, where they've had a Republican governor, Massachusetts, Vermont, these are all states that are way more Democratic than Minnesota, but Republicans have found a way to win statewide and be competitive. And I think it starts with recognizing that Minnesota's a blue state. Maybe it's a purple state, but it does lean to the left. In order for Republicans to win, they can't talk like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They can't focus on issues like an Alabama Republican would. They have to talk like blue state Republicans. Now, that doesn't mean they're any less principled or any less focused on implementing the conservative agenda, but they have to articulate that vision in an intelligent and smart fashion. And what we've seen historically is that more and more Republican campaigns are focusing on the conservative base. And that's fine for getting the conservative base out, but that's not enough to win in Minnesota. You have to appeal to centrist independents as well as a small group of Democrats to get them to switch over. And that's why, candidly, I'm pretty disappointed that Donald Trump's our nominee this year. I think Joe Biden is in a place where he could easily be defeated by a conservative, whether it was DeSantis or Haley. I think we're well positioned to run against a guy who's in his 80s. And unfortunately, with Trump as the nominee, you basically have two candidates who independent voters don't want to vote for. Now, that being said, Trump may end up winning despite that. But I think in places like Minnesota, we are better served by having those who can be successful in articulating a conservative vision that is positive, that is inclusive, that practices politics of addition and multiplication as opposed to the politics of subtraction and division.
It's challenging to understand that you're not running for reelection. And we're going to have a little bit of a brief conversation about that. You are one of the good ones. You are one of the good ones. I've said that long before I had a podcast. I've always believed that Pat Garofalo was one of the good ones.
Hey, first of all, I'm susceptible to flattery, so please just keep complimenting me. Absolutely, I appreciate it.
And I will say this: there's a couple legislators that have stepped away that are going to be stepping away, and I'm really disappointed by it. And this isn't contrived or fake, and you haven't paid me to say this, but you are legitimately one of the good ones. And there's just a lot of common sense approaches that you've taken on solving a lot of issues and working to solve some issues. And I was very disappointed when I saw the news that you weren't running for reelection. I do hope that you're not closing the door on elected office, because I think there's an Becky and I have talked a lot about the Republican brand and Republicans succeeding, and Republicans particularly winning in the suburbs. And I can think of just losing your institutional knowledge, your political knowledge, your experience, and your perspective, even though I disagree with you on some issues, is just a loss for the team.
I appreciate the kind words. I appreciate the compliments. But this is something that I've been a state legislator for 19 years. I've enjoyed my service. I've enjoyed working for people. I enjoy learning and sometimes figuring out things I've been wrong about. I enjoy that. But the reality is that politics is not a marathon. You don't run until you're completely exhausted and collapse across the finish line. It's a relay race. You go out and sprint as fast as you can, and then you pass the baton to someone else. So that part of I'm interested in public service, but I won't run for elected office again. I've put enough time in and served time that I understand my strengths and my weaknesses, and the reality, whether I choose to acknowledge it or not, but my brand of conservatism is just not that dominant in Minnesota. And as much as I want that to change, it's an acknowledgement of reality. Would I love to be in a higher form of elected office with being able to say public policy? Sure, yeah, but that's just not the reality of things. It's not where most Republicans are. It's not where Minnesota voters are. And I think you're seeing, candidly, a lot of Democrats too, who are finding that their party is shifting away. That both parties are having more and more the debate being monopolized by the extremes, and it's just not who I am.
If you look at the rich tapestry of American political history, there's a number of candidates just like yourself who stepped away for a time. And I think there's a path here. And I'm not going to give up the dream that you're going to be serving an elective office. You are far too young to not be seeking elected office, to not be a part of the voice. And I guarantee you there's an organized effort of people wanting to make sure that the hopes and dreams are alive of Representative Pat Garofalo, or Pat Garofalo serving in any office at some point. So be prepared for an ongoing draft effort to get you for any available office.
I appreciate that. And again, I am susceptible to flattery. So please, by all means, just praise me. But at the federal level right now, Congress is running an over $1 trillion budget deficit. Right? This is completely unsustainable. At some point here, the bond market is going to impose discipline on the Congress. And we don't have members of either party doing anything about it. And the budget deficit, make no mistake about it, the budget deficit at the federal level and the debt are a threat to the quality of life of every single American. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old, black or white, it doesn't matter. This is a threat to everyone's quality of life, and none of these guys are doing anything about it. And so, yeah, I'd like to make a difference and get people to focus on the deficit, but it's hard when, from a fiscal perspective, at the federal level, there isn't much of a difference between Republicans and Democrats.
We appreciate your perspective. I do hope that you'll continue to stay active. I do hope that we can rely on you for a punchy quote or analysis, even when you're in this very brief, I hope, time where you're back in the wilderness amongst the people. But before you seek elected office again, you'll always have a place here on our podcast for both compliments and probably some criticisms too.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, I don't know what the future holds for me. It's an exciting time in my life because I have all this energy that I put into politics and public administration. I've worked during the legislative session, I work full time at my private sector job. So I'm going to have all this extra energy, and it's just a matter of deciding what it is I want to put it into, whether it's charitable work, political, nonprofit, or other things. It's really, I've got a lot of opportunities there. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit nervous because I'm such a high energy person, not knowing what I'll be doing next year. But I do have a private sector job as a network engineer, and that's my fallback position. Things aren't too bad. So we'll see what God has planned for me. But I am excited to see what I can do to continue to learn things, to continue to meet people, and to try to a certain degree, try to educate people on things we can be doing that position Minnesota for the future. It's just not going to be an elected office.
For now, let's not make statements that we can't answer.
He's relentless.
Well, I don't know if you have a Google alert for your name, but you may become aware of in some time, and I'll just put you on the spot, you may become aware of that a draft Garofalo URL has been purchased. Just an FYI to you, there's already a movement afoot because you are one of the good ones. And that doesn't mean that I agree with you on every issue, but you are one of the good ones that has been really waving the flag for Republicans. And I just hope that there's, whether you do, I hope you're happy, you're safe, your family's good. And I hope that there's an opportunity for you down the road because I think you would do a fantastic job. You have done a great job.
Thank you for saying that. And in the short term, the most important thing is we really do, in my opinion, we need to restore balance to Minnesota government. And we cannot have another 2 years of the hard left, far left doing this. In a place like New York, they're the financial markets, the financial hub of the Western Hemisphere. California is the cultural and entertainment hub of the Western Hemisphere. To a certain degree, they can get away with crazy policies. In Minnesota, we can't do this. And you're seeing some of the wealth destruction and demand destruction taking place now. And so we need to restore Minnesota to what its really a strategic strength is, and that's working together rather than having 51% jam their legislative agenda down the throat of the other 49%.
Agreed. And one thing I just want to say in closing is I'm very hopeful you'll still be offering all of your wisdom and thoughts and funny, witty statements on Twitter. Where can people follow you now and in the future?
So my Twitter account is at Pat Garofalo, and if you don't know how to spell Garofalo, just remember the vowels go A-O-A-O. So it's Pat, Garofalo on Twitter. That's probably the best way to see what I'm thinking and thoughts that I share. I'm on Facebook too, but that's mostly like just for friends and family and stuff like that. But that's where I talk about sports, pop culture, jokes, and all my training to someday hopefully be a stand-up comedian or something like that. I don't know.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again. Becky, we just interviewed Representative Pat Garofalo. Your take.
Like you said, he is one of the good ones. It's definitely a loss to the legislature, to the state, to not have him up there. He's been there. He's been a great advocate, vocal, fought for things that were not always the most popular. He's done some bipartisan work. He's done some really great things, and certainly sad to see him go, but definitely excited to see what comes from him in the future. But through chatting with him, I think he just has great takes on things. I think it's important again to look at the Uber Lyft debacle and how it is a mess of the Democrats' own making, and looking at all of these things we've been talking about for the last year and a half about all of the issues that have arose from the Democrats' lack of being thoughtful, moving slow, working through things, and not having them up there to call them out and to hold their feet to the fire is certainly going to be disappointing.
He's just one of the good ones. And when I heard he wasn't running, it was just disappointing. I understand. I'm glad he's making this choice voluntarily. He's moving on, but he's just one of the good ones, as we've discussed. And in particular, I think I don't agree with him on all issues. There's not many elected officials that I do agree with on all issues, but I think Pat Garofalo is one of the good ones. I think he's someone that goes to the state capitol and tries to work for solutions through his ideological lens that he has. And there are good Democrats that do the exact same thing.
Absolutely.
It's just disappointing, but I wish him the best. I wish his family the best. And I do hope he seeks elected office at some time down the road again, because I do believe that he has the right balance that I think Republicans need right now. And it's just disappointing to know that he's not going to be waving that flag. And I can be selfish and just make it about me for a second, but it's just disappointing. But I wish him the best. I wish him all of the success. And I think we're still going to have opportunities to talk to him. He's not going away. But I just think as we've done this podcast over the last 18 months or whatever, he's just one of the people that we've identified and we've spoken with more than once. And offline, there's good discussions. He's just a larger than life person, and he's just a real character, and he's going to be missed.
Absolutely. I have to imagine we'll have him back on. I don't think that he's going to be quiet and shy in his off seasons here in his retirements. Go follow him. He's a good follow. And so we'll be following along. But what is next for us? We are going to go. It seems like we should just make this a regular weekly segment these days. We're going to chat about abortion again. We saw in the last couple of days, former President Donald Trump put out a video about abortion. In it, he said that states should be deciding abortion laws for themselves. He said that he backs fertility treatments like IVF, He supports exceptions to abortion bans in cases of rape, incest, and the life of the mother. And part of his quote was, "You must follow your heart, or in many cases, your religion or your faith. Do what's right for your family and what is right for yourself." What do you think?
I listen to it. When you read it, it sounds more reasonable. But when he reads it, it's not as sincere and it's not as effective. I think it was a messy statement. I think that, and it's interesting because, as you noted, this is a subject we've talked about a lot, but particularly, I have this filter for this kind of way in which I'm now, when I hear about abortion related news and we discuss the politics of a lot on the podcast, I think of it immediately in the lens of how you and I have discussed it. And so I understood what he was trying to do. I don't think he was successful in what he wanted to accomplish. Donald Trump, the abortion is going to be on the ballot in 2024. As much as Republicans don't want to admit that reality, it is. And Donald Trump is part of the reason, because of his picks for the United States Supreme Court, that we're dealing with this issue as it's continuing to become an issue. Republicans, as we've discussed, have not had a good message on this. And I think that they politically operated in a little bit of safe harbor on abortion because it was constitutionally protected. But once that was taken away by the United States Supreme Court and it was ruled unconstitutional for the reasons that it was, and it was sent back to the states, we're now into this situation. And so I think it's going to be very difficult on the issue of abortion for Republicans to win unless they have a concise, clear message. And this kind of states' rights issue is not going to be it. It's not going to be it.
Now, I'm a big states' rights gal and tend to lean on that a decent amount. This, though, I agree with you. First of all, a 4-minute video is never the answer to any PR or messaging crisis. It just is not. There's too much. It's too messy. And then there was a lot of people picking this apart of things that he said and didn't say. He didn't say whether he would support or not support a federal ban if he is elected. He did not support or say whether he supports existing state bans. So those things were frustrating to some folks. And obviously there was some big reactions from folks largely within the pro-life community who very much take aim at this. That there was a lot of different conversations before he was elected the first time about different things that he should do, must do, promised to do. His former vice president, Mike Pence, called it a slap in the face to the anti-abortion voters who supported President Trump, said too many Republican politicians are all too ready to wash their hands off of the battle for life. And then Lindsey Graham was outspoken. Trump did swing back at both Senator Lindsey Graham and a president of a pro-life group. He posted on Truth Social, "Lindsay, Marjorie, and others fought for years unsuccessfully until I came along and got the job done. We cannot let our country suffer any further damage by losing elections on an issue that always says, or that should always have been decided by the state and now will be." Now, that right there, we all know this is a political video. We all know this is a political move, not a policy move for him. And then he just outs himself right there of, we cannot continue to lose elections on this issue, which I agree. But man, oh man, it's messy, man.
Yes, let me offer a particular take on this. So, if you're a Republican running for office right now, let's say you're a Republican who wants to have what Republicans would define, or is what you and I would maybe define as a sensible position on abortion. I'm personally pro-life, but I believe, so the question would become to a Republican candidate, male or female, would be, what would be your position on abortion? What would you do if you're in office? What would be the votes that you would support? What type of legislative changes would you be at? Now, I start from the position on the issue of abortion that as of right now in the state of Minnesota, it is legal up until the moment of birth for there to be an abortion in this state. I sincerely believe that the vast majority of Minnesotans, I shouldn't say vast majority, or the majority of Minnesotans want some bit of range on that issue. I don't know if you polled Minnesotans. My instinct tells me that if you polled Minnesotans on the issue of abortion, I don't know if they would want there to be, if the poll question was asked, if it was, do you want abortion during the first 9 months, the full term of a pregnancy? I don't know what that poll would come back. My instinct tells me, just my kind of bias, is that I don't think that would be a majority position. I think that most Minnesotans want there to be, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, but they should have full and complete access to the under certain circumstances. That's where I think the electorate is. The problem, and I would push back and say, when we get to that point, let me know if you disagree with me on that take. So that's where I'm starting from. And so the issue here is right now, if you're a Republican candidate running for the legislature in Minnesota, it'd be reasonable to ask you, what's your position on what's going on in other states? Are you supportive of what's going on? As much as you want to answer the question and say, I'm running for the legislature in Minnesota, I'm running for this in Minnesota. The introduction of abortion into electoral politics for Republicans right now is like introducing kryptonite to Superman. It's just not helpful, and it's harmful because Republicans don't have a message that's moored and tethered in any type of consistent way. So what Trump has just done is he's punted it off to the states. And the problem is that we don't have a national message for Republicans on abortion. We now have a patchwork of messages that are being pursued in individual states, and Republicans aren't going to succeed that way on this issue. That's why, in contrast, Trump's message is so much more worse than what Walz was able to say. And the question I will go back to, is there a Republican statement that could be made on abortion that is as crisp and clean as Walz's was on the progressive side, on the Democratic side, and not create the type of trouble for Republicans? And I'm continually coming to the conclusion after we have these conversations that Republicans just need to either stop talking about abortion or really do some soul searching on the reality of where Americans are at, because I think they're going to continue to lose on this issue. Your take?
No, I completely agree. I think the closest thing that we have to a good Republican message on this is Nikki Haley in one of the presidential debates, how she framed it up. But I think it's such a hard thing because, well, you want to, sure, let's stop talking about it. Democrats are not going to let that happen. They simply are not going to let that happen. And for good reason. There's certainly, just before this taping, we saw what happened in Arizona, where they basically said a state ban of abortions from 1864 or maybe I made that year
No,
up.
1864.
There you
You're
go.
right.
It stands that it's a complete and total ban of abortions in Arizona. And so there are real repercussions and real actions for this issue. And it is something that's going to continue to evolve. There's going to be continual court cases and legislation, and it's not going away. So we need to excuse my language, we need to figure our shit out on this. It's mind boggling that we still, out of all of these different groups and different organizations and different candidates, that we haven't been able to have somebody coalesce behind, let's say this, let's have somebody put together something that is saying something without saying anything. And I don't know the perfect answer to that. Obviously, nobody else does either, but it's going to continue to be here. So we need to figure this out so that Republicans, regardless of what the candidate's personal views on abortion, that they're able to talk to voters, because this is going to be something that they're going to be continued to be asked about. And especially with Trump punting it to the states, that's going to be something that down ballot candidates and members are going to have to address here. You mentioned the insincerity of Trump in this message, or in this video, and I think that's who he is as a person. I feel like insincere of what he's saying is largely that. But I did think, and I'll tweet this link out, when I was looking up to find this video again, an article came up from CNN that was published just today. 13 times Trump abortion position shifted over the last 25 years. And it's just
Holy
really,
moly.
yeah. And 13 is a little higher than I expected, but I don't know what the answer is here. I do understand why him and his campaign decided to try to do something and take some of that heat off of him, because you guarantee he's getting so many conversations and so many pushes from those pro-life people to come out and say, I will ban abortion. And it needed to get that off so people could stop saying that. So I do understand the political reasons for doing this, but I don't think he's going to get away with it being that simple and him not having to talk about this anymore.
I think abortion is going to continually be an issue for Republicans. In part, I want to go back to something you said about the Democrats not letting Republicans get away with it. Here's the environment that I think we're in right now, is that because Republicans for so many years had that perceived safe harbor of not formulating a more in-depth policy and political statement on where they stand on abortion, because they had the protection of Roe v. Wade. Now that's been removed, it's somewhat open season to figure out what their positions are. I think the political climate is that if a Republican goes out and messages on abortion, in any type of way that wants to limit the right of someone to get an abortion, even if it's a more centrist position on abortion, where I have a feeling where most Minnesotans are,
Mhm.
I think it's an incredibly difficult environment for Republicans to talk about without there being a very significant echo chamber that will carry that message, and it becomes a very mobilizing issue for Democrats. If I was a legislative candidate, if I was advising a Republican who wanted to run statewide, I would really stress upon them, figure out where the state is really at on the issue, but in no way, shape, or form would I encourage there to be any type of message that would limit or reduce the ability or limit the ability for people to have access to an abortion, because I think it's right now, the conversation is so polarized in a way that I think it's the Democrats have found a way to use that passion, that belief in that in such a mobilizing way, particularly in the suburbs, to have and Republicans, I think, have done such an incredibly poor job of messaging on it. It's very easy to turn all Republicans, or any Republican, even if they have what some might argue be a bit of a centrist position on the issue, to turn them into a gargoyle or some type of monster on the issue. And so I think that Walls's answer, I'm literally still up to this point where if I was, I would say, just say what Walz says, have
Yeah.
that be the position. And because that's the way in which I think you can talk about it in a way, obviously you need to believe it, but his framing of it, I think, is the messaging standard by which all abortion rhetoric in terms of campaigning and the politics of it are going to be judged by. And again, we're talking just about the politics, the campaign ads, the mailings, the lit pieces, the attack ads. I'm not talking about the substance of the policy, but just in the context of that kind of politicization of abortion and how it's on the campaign. It's just a very difficult issue for Republicans to message on. And I think Trump's message is messy. I think it's very messy. Tim Walz gave on national television a very succinct, precise answer on the issue of abortion that I think, aside from partisans criticizing him, would give him no pushback inside his own party. No pushback and no substantive pushback inside his party. Look at what the Republican, the front runner and the de facto nominee of the Republican Party, the head of the Republican Party during this upcoming election cycle, Donald Trump, said, and look at the internal problems that he created for himself. So it just continues to be an issue that Republicans have a problem getting away from, because ultimately, I think Republicans didn't do the work on the issue.
Right.
And so I'm gravitating towards continuing, as we have these discussions, continuing to look back at Walz's statement and say, ultimately, that's a pretty good statement.
Yeah.
And absent someone telling me how a Republican can win statewide on the issue of abortion, that they can message and navigate, that's a pretty good message for Republicans to have, because I don't see how this issue is going away for Republicans, and they need to deal with it in terms of the political and real world realities of what they're facing right now.
I want to play devil's advocate
Of course you do.
here briefly. So you talked about that we really need to figure out where Minnesotans stand on this. Do you think that answer to that is putting it on the ballot?
Putting it on the ballot in terms of like a constitutional amendment, that's one way to gauge. But I would be very curious from just an academic standpoint, from a polling standpoint,
Yep.
where the state truly is. My bias and instinct is a little bit of bias, a little bit of instinct, is that I don't know that what we currently have in law, if Minnesotans knew the full details of it, if they had the option to directly influence the law, if that's where they would land. So I think the Democrats have staked out a position on abortion that is, I think, out of step, I think, with some significant percentage of Minnesotans. That by no way means that Minnesotans would want to dial that back. But I do think, just from a policy standpoint, I think that the access to abortion is, and what it currently is in law, is very significant incredibly significant that I do wonder if there was the ability for Minnesotans to fully grasp the true nature of it and where it would go. I think that would surprise a number of people because, in part, if you looked at the rhetoric during the 2022 campaign, where Governor Walz was on the issue and what he campaigned on versus what he signed into law, and where Minnesotans have gone on this, I think it's there is a bit of a change. I think he has adopted a very smart message in the reality of what happened in Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision and what occurred. But I do think that if Minnesotans had a clear, just from a polling perspective, to offer their position on abortion, I do wonder where it would land in terms of what the state allows right now. But I think that message, the ability for Republicans to, if there was a situation where Minnesotans supported somewhat of a more limited circumstance where someone could gain access to an abortion and have an abortion, I wonder if Republicans would be able to message on that, because that might be landing a message on the head of a pin. And so that's why I just think that this is not a winning issue for Republicans. It's certainly not when they have this message, but I don't believe it's a long-term winning message for Republicans. But I was speaking just mostly from an academic polling standpoint.
I figured I just had to poke you a little bit. And then before we end, I just have to, because it's on my mind every time we talk about this, but there's a Veep episode about this. Great show. If you haven't watched it, highly recommend it. But there is one where they literally just have a board up and they're like, pick a week. Talking to Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character, pick a week. You just got to pick a week. She's and it is something that's always in my head because it is so hard. And I can't imagine when you are going through those, having to pick a week, whatever, if they're trying to rein in what is currently allowed under law to make it more safe, legal, and rare, and not have it up to the time of birth or whatever it makes be. Is that 15 weeks? Is that 20 weeks? What is that? And what does that truly mean to the fetus and to the life? And there's so many different ways to look at this. And if a fetus can feel pain, and when it is actually considered a baby, and when is it able to sustain life outside of the womb, and so many different things. And I'm certainly not the expert on any of this. I have my personal opinions, but I think it is something we've been talking about quite a bit. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. Obviously, we're not just going to talk about it to talk about it. It is as things pop up, like this Trump video. So if you want to use 4 minutes of your day to go watch it, go find that video from President Trump, and he might tweet something different out tomorrow. So we will see.
Thank you for having that discussion again.
You bet. Moving on, we are going to step a little bit away from politics here and talk about basketball. Now, I am not a basketball expert by any means. However, fun fact, I did play basketball from kindergarten up until high school. So I have about 8-9 years of a basketball experience under my belt. Love it. It's fun. March Madness is great. We'll come back to how you feel about this year's March Madness brackets here soon.
Oof.
But we are going to start with Caitlin Clark. So this is something, Caitlin Clark playing for Iowa, huge impact on the game, on women's basketball, on women in sports in general. So I want to throw it to you to kick us off here.
I thought it was fantastic. A couple things about me. I've never played an organized game of basketball in my life. Basketball is a winter sport. I played hockey. I was also very short growing up, and so basketball just wasn't my thing. I have played a couple games of pig/horse, and I don't have a very good record at it. And if you're thinking about me playing basketball, just think of the worst basketball player you could perceive, and that's me, just from a standpoint. That being so, I also, that affinity for basketball has not translated. My lack of interest or playing basketball has not really carried over into watching the sport. I'm not a big basketball watcher. I think the last Timberwolves game I went to was probably 20 some years ago. And so this resurgence of basketball, particularly women's basketball, is something that is incredibly foreign to me because I'm just not a basketball watcher. Sure, I watched Jordan play basketball. I watched the Dream Team. Some people pinged me after I sent out a tweet about basketball saying, "So you've never watched a game of basketball?" No, I've watched basketball. But in terms of consistency, the last month or so, the last few weeks, I've watched more basketball than I have probably in my life, just in terms of following the sport. My wife's from Iowa. Caitlin Clark has been with Iowa down there. So we've been watching a lot more basketball, and it has just been absolutely fantastic to watch. I'm learning more about basketball. I'm watching it more. It's just been an absolutely fantastic tournament and to watch. the competitiveness and basketball. I'm become a big fan and a bandwagon fan to the sport of basketball. But I just want to make sure I'm clear about something. You played basketball in high school?
I stopped when I was in high school
Okay, so you
because I
played
wanted to be a
basketball.
cheerleader instead.
Okay, but you played it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm seriously, true story. I've never played an organized game of basketball in my life. Not in school, not like outside with buddies. It's just never been my thing. And once people saw me dribble the ball and shoot, I was never going to get picked on even a pickup game team.
So I do want to chat a little bit just about some of the stats and numbers surrounding Caitlin Clark and her impact on the sport. Up until the last few years, first of all, did you know? I just as I was researching, I found out the women's tournament was not able to use March Madness in any of their promotions or anything up until 2 years ago. That was
Come
reframed.
on.
Yeah,
Is this like
just
this?
the men.
What was, we already had a discussion of this. Was this about the Super Bowl too? You were talking about the
The
reference.
big game.
You're such a rule follower. Are we going to get in trouble now for saying March Madness? Just like
No.
you say we couldn't say the Super Bowl?
3 years ago, we maybe would have gotten in trouble, but now they allow it.
Remember, you're the legal advisor to this podcast
Right,
because you have 1 year of law school.
Exactly.
Okay.
But so in the championship game, South Carolina versus Iowa, 18.7 million people watched that. Now that had peaked, that was the top of any other March Madness tournament in recent or ever. But in recent years, 2023, it was just under 15 million, 2022, 18 million. Now, the men's tournament this year, the championship game did surpass 20 million. So there is that. But it's just been an incredible spike in the overall watching and viewership of the women's games. And also with this, the economic impact that Caitlin, and they literally call it like the Caitlin effect or impact, that there is a report that projected that women's sports will generate more than $1 billion in global revenue this year, up roughly 300% from the company's estimate in 2021. And just globally, the sponsorships with women are now on par with what men are getting. Caitlin Clark herself, with this new change in name, image, likeness, and being able to get sponsorship, she is already valued at $3 million, which will be more than what her projected salary would be for her rookie season in the WNBA. So Caitlin herself, got to give her some props here with her. She surpassed all of these records. First Division I player to top 3,000 points, 1,000 assists, and 800 rebounds. But the thing that really sticks with me is how much she has embraced her impact for other women and for young girls and for the sports themselves. It's got to be a little tough. You're in the sport. You're focused on, she's going to school. She's playing a sport. There's a lot going on in this woman's life. And she still is taking the opportunity to push and prod and make sure that this is a continued effect on women's sports. A couple quotes that she said, you see it with other sports. Continue to invest in time, money, and resources for those people, meaning women, and give them the opportunities. I think that's what's going to drive women's sports in the future. And then said, people will remember the moments that they shared at one of our games or watching on TV and how excited their daughter or son got about watching women's basketball. And I really think it is just incredible to see how much people really got to this point of loving her and then cherishing the sport of women's basketball altogether.
Correct. I would say to you that if there was a channel dedicated to paint drying versus watching a basketball game prior to Caitlin Clark, I would have probably watched the paint drying channel. And that includes some great NBA games. It's just not my thing. It's just not my sport. I don't understand it. It's just, I can't, it does nothing for me. But the introduction of Caitlin Clark, and particularly as I said, my wife's from Iowa, so we were watching one of the games. They're just as competitive as hell to watch. They're fun to watch. And it was for me to set aside a time like, okay, we have to watch this game, or me to even know that about particularly basketball is so foreign. And I attribute that all to Caitlin Clark and all the other fantastic athletes in women's college basketball and watching some of those games. It's just amazing to watch. And I think there's so many women in that sport that are just fantastic ambassadors. But props to Caitlin Clark for just dominating in her sport. And she came up short on Sunday in the NCAA championship game. But to get a call out from the coach, like she did from the coach of South Carolina, for her leadership in the game, how she's put that mark on the game of basketball and all women's sports, I just think is remarkable. Hats off to her. I wish her all the success. And I'm going to continue watching women's basketball because it was just fantastic. It was incredibly entertaining to watch. And I say that as someone who has never been invested in any type of significant way in the game of basketball.
Agree. It's been impressive. It's been incredible. And I hope it keeps up 2024 here. Let's give women's sports the credit that they deserve.
We should end the podcast right here. Let's cut it off right here.
Are
There's
you
no
sure?
need.
Do you want to chat a little bit about how do I know you like to have different kind of wagers or brackets. How'd you do this year?
So I do, as you partake in a number of brackets I have consistently over the years, which is interesting. Generally, the most amount of thought I give to basketball because I want to participate in the brackets that they have for the NCAA. I have done NCAA brackets over the years, which again, that March Madness time is generally the most amount of time when I like auto pick the draft is the most amount of time when I have filled out brackets, the most amount of time of thought I've put into brackets. But there was a family bracket my sister set up for family members and her husband did. I was not successful. What Becky's getting at is she knows that I didn't win and that I lost to my little sister again.
Oh, and you had to out yourself because otherwise she was going to, which is just makes my heart really happy. I apologize for your raining on your parade.
Yes. So what we're doing here is we're getting ahead of a PR problem. My little sister won the league, bumped me off from getting any money, any points for whatever I would have gotten, bragging rights. And in the text message back to me where she's announcing and rubbing this victory in my face, she was going to note that she was going to reach out to Becky and self-disclose that I'd lost once again because this is the same sister. Yes, it's the same sister who won the fantasy football league. And so once again, my big mouth has gotten ahead of me. So we're trying to deal with this PR crisis ahead of time. I'm trying to get ahead of my sister, Kathleen, reaching out to Becky and divulging her placement. So I'm dealing with it honestly and transparently. But that's why we're having this discussion.
That it sure is. So watch out. Caitlin Clark is a force to be reckoned with in the basketball world. And Kathleen is a force to be reckoned with in your guys' fantasy football and brackets. And bravo.
Bravo. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you. Have a good one.
We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Broad Corbin Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the platform where you listen. You can leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at @BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Broad Corbin Becky will return next week. Thank you again for listening.